Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction Podcast.
We've all heard of H.G. Wells, the famed British author, best known for his science fiction novels and short stories, many of which can be found in Flame Tree's anthologies. However, have you ever thought about what would happen if you used a time machine to travel back in time to meet the man behind those well-known words? Both of the stories in today's episode will make you question how much you really know about H.G. Wells, the man and his literary outpourings. Our first story is by Dominick Cancilla and is called Shaping Things to Come. We found this one in our collection Time Travelling Short Stories, and how fitting considering The Time Machine is one of H.G. Wells' most famous pieces of work. So here is Shaping Things to Come by Dominick Cancilla, read by Nathan Chatilier.
Herbert never knew if he was alone. He kept windows and doors barred, trapping the day's heat in a room full of stale air, but providing no protection where intruders were concerned. Although it was late afternoon, he lay in near darkness atop sweat-soaked sheets and listened for any hint of a hound's approach. Because his cabin was well away from the city, there were no passers-by or motor cars to disturb him. For that reason, any sound could be significant. The trees rustled outside his window, sending worry crawling up the back of his neck. A simple summer breeze, or someone attempting to reach his roof and chimney. The soft roar of the kiln in the corner made it even more difficult to separate innocuous noise from subtle alarm, but it was a necessary evil. Herbert half wished that one of them would appear, as one might wish for the other boot to drop. The constant worry was far worse than the eventual materialization. It clawed at his mind, kept him jumping at shadows, ate at his sleep. Herbert hadn't been able to rest without first reaching the point of exhaustion since before the first hound. Knowing that it was in some odd, unquantifiable measure his fault only made things that much worse, and having grown dependent on them pushed him to within a hair's breadth of madness. Across the room, the clock struck 3. Its chimes had once recalled more innocent days, but at present they only reminded him of the time. All the other possessions Herbert's parents' double suicide had made his had long ago found their way to a pawn shop or private sale, to snipping a few links from his great chain of debt. He made a silent promise that the clock would follow shortly. Just as the last echo of 3 o'clock was fading from his aching head, a short, sharp puff of air washed over Herbert. He sat up quickly and fumbled to light the lamp on the table beside him. He had first felt that breeze in his mother's kitchen when he was a lad of 11, just before a barely dressed woman had appeared from nowhere and started asking Mama very personal questions, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The woman, she'd asked to be called simply the biographer, came whenever she pleased all through Herbert's youth, eventually scraping raw his parents' nerves along with his own. She would show up at mealtimes when they had company, even while he was in the privy. It was not unusual to be awakened in the middle of the night by the feel of her sitting upon the mattress beside him. This first hound was always in a great hurry, and offended in her self-importance if everything was not dropped so that her inquiries could be tended to. Herbert had finally stopped her when he was 16, but by that time he was friendless, and his family was too far gone to be saved. The lamp sputtered to life, spreading light and shadow through Herbert's room. The furniture and bare walls hadn't changed in the 15 years he'd lived in the cabin. He liked the monotony of them, having learned to loathe anything new or surprising, but surprises was something he could not easily avoid. The hound appeared like clockwork 12.5 seconds after the heralding burst of air. It was a man this time, tall, lean, muscular, tanned white, and grinning like an idiot. He wore no mask, which made him pre-2240, and wore a grey dress, which put him after 2053. The belt of lights around his waist indicated he'd not reached the 22nd century. His stiff hat further narrowed the possibilities. Herbert guessed 2080 or thereabouts. There should be no trouble understanding the man's speech, though it may be a bit odd. The intruder had no visible translation device, so the aging tomes beneath his arm were likely in English, a great convenience. "Mr. Wells," said the hound, apparently oblivious to the rudeness of appearing in a man's room uninvited, "my name is Tiberius, and come to visit from year 2088. He paused for effect. "In the 21st century." Over the years, Herbert had noticed that the further in the future a hound came from, the less time he would stay. A quick mental calculation based on decades of careful record-keeping revealed that this particular intruder's stay would last some 125 minutes, a decent amount of time, and probably enough for Herbert to wring something useful from the distasteful encounter. Since contacting people in the past was apparently a crime, everyone who came back to harass Herbert did so covertly, and they all assumed they were the only ones who had. Because he hated the smug bastards with passion unbounded, it disgusted Herbert to play along with their conceited fantasies, but it seemed the only way to get what he wanted. He got up from the bed, wide-eyed in mock wonder. "My goodness, a time traveller," Herbert said, with long-practiced surprise. "Why, this is the most fantastic moment of my experience. Are you aware that I've written a story on that very subject?" It was a blatant lie, of course. Herbert hadn't put two words of fiction together in his life. The state of his nerves made it impossible for him to concentrate on creative writing or anything of the sort. How could he craft sentence and plot knowing that any moment one of the hounds might appear to demand his attention? And besides, his tastes ran more towards social and political works than romances of science. But claiming authorship of the time travel novel never failed to thrill the annoying bastards. He wondered how they would feel if they knew that his manuscript of it sat in a trunk beneath the bed, and that he blamed it so thoroughly for his present situation that he intended never to publish it, unless his financial situation became somehow even more unbearable. "Truth," the hound said, still grinning like a loon in response to Herbert's question. "That's why I came, Mr. Wells. The Time Machine has been my favoured read since I hatched." Since the man was pre-24th century, Herbert knew that the reference to hatching was just a turn of phrase. "Because of the way tech works, time is limited," he let out a cough-short laugh, as if he'd made a joke. "I'll get to facts. I'm a PENDUS fan, and I request you sign these for me." He held out his stack of books. They always had a stack of books. "Certainly, my boy, certainly. Just put them on the desk and I'll be right with you." Herbert pointed to the aging roll-top across the room, behind the hound. "Without problems." The fool followed Herbert's direction like an automaton. "Could you find my fountain pen in the desk as well, please? And tell me more about how this time travel business works while you're at it. Is it similar to the concept I used in my book?" The hound's resulting chatter gave Herbert opportunity to retrieve the pistol from beneath his pillow, and noise to cover any telltale sound he might make. "Happily," the hound said, rolling the desk open with some effort after taking a moment to puzzle out how it worked. "At the apex of flight, the traveller enters norm space for a limited time and blah blah blah." Herbert paid no attention to a speech he'd heard 100 times before, but concentrated on padding silently across the room. The uninvited guest babbled on, comparing the reality of time travel to Herbert's book and a movie some pal of his had made. Herbert put the pistol to the base of the hound's skull and pulled the trigger. Ever since he discovered that people from the 24th century and beyond were bulletproof, Herbert had experienced a brief moment of unbearable tension each time he fired his pistol into a hound. So, it was with a great deal of relief that Herbert saw the hound's head explode and his body crumble to the bare floor like a stricken marionette. Ignoring the spreading mess, Herbert dropped the gun on the desk and dragged the body toward the kiln. He could hardly wait to see what books the hound had brought, and as such made quick work of the disposal. The bullet had passed clear through, and so did not need to be removed, another convenience. The first few times he'd killed hounds, Herbert had worried that some kind of temporal police would show up to place him in irons. Certainly, someone would notice if time travelers kept returning as freshly murdered corpses. Erasing evidence of the crime with fire was an early solution, and it seemed to work. But if the lack of intervention by authorities was due to his efforts, or because for some reason authorities were unable to detect in what time the victim had been slain, he did not know. In fact, for all he knew, these criminals had kept their trip so secret that they were not discovered even after their disappearance. It hardly mattered, so long as the reality of the situation kept working in his favor. So, with no legal ramifications and no mess, the bodies disappeared down to the last platelet when their time ran out. Herbert had become quite the confident assassin. It was a mystery to Herbert why a bullet lodged in a body returned to the future along with the corpse, just as he assumed the ink from his signature in a book did, but nothing brought from the future could be left in the past. Of course, if future objects could be left behind, Herbert would have little excuse for killing the hounds, and that would be a shame indeed. After getting the lantern, Herbert took a seat at his desk and pulled the hound's books towards him. The Shape of Things to Come, The Time Machine, of course, and great SF short stories. A good selection. He opened the third book first, since it was rare for a hound to bring anything with stories by authors other than Wells in it. The book's table of contents listed 3 of his short stories: The Man Who Could Work Miracles, The Crystal Egg, and I, Robot, a story for which Herbert learned he'd gotten credit for creating the word robotics. All of them were stories he'd already published. After giving the matter careful thought, he chose There Will Come Soft Rains by one Ray Bradbury, both because it encountered the author's name in conversation with hounds and because the story was short enough for him to get through in the time he had before the book vanished. When he first got the idea of copying from the books that were brought to him, Herbert had been fool enough to try and ask the hounds for permission. Most had been rudely indignant that such a great man would even consider such a thing, and all informed him that doing so might disrupt the time stream irreparably. They were, 2-1, hypocrites. Herbert's attempt at becoming a draper or pharmacist had come to nothing, and his prospects for eroding his mountain of debt would be bleak indeed without what he took from the hounds. Fortunately, Herbert had been able to sell every story he'd copied, and a magazine would soon be serializing the novel about Martians that he'd painstakingly duplicated over the years. It brought in enough to keep him barely fed without having to resort to an outside job where his nervousness would bring odd looks, and in a few more years, his debt would finally be gone. The story he'd selected from the anthology turned out to be quite good, if a little flowery. With luck, it would keep the few critics who'd noted Herbert praising his ability to write in varied styles. Indeed, the story was good enough that he would be proud to have written it. This was the first time Herbert had copied a story that had another author's name attached, at least as far as he could recall. Once he copied it under his own name, it would be his story so far as history was concerned, and the hound's book he now held would have an alternate table of contents. But would he remember that the story had once been credited to another author? Herbert didn't know, and at the moment he was really too busy to give it much thought. It took Herbert some 3/4 of an hour to copy the story, writing with the great speed of pen he'd cultivated. When the hurry of work was past, Herbert set pen aside with a relieved sigh. Exhaustion rose up in him like cool water filling a bath. He was momentarily tempted by thoughts of trying to sleep, and had just gotten up from his chair when what calm he had gathered was stolen by a knock on the door. Who could it be at 4 p.m. at such a remote location? A traveller in need? An officer of the law? A rabid creditor? No matter who it was trouble. The stench from the kiln would still be there for 10 or 15 minutes at least. There was some blood on his hands and clothing, and bloody footprints ran here and there on the floor. If he let anyone into the cabin, all would be lost. Because lantern light was certainly leaking beneath the door, he could not pretend to be away from home. "Who is it?" he called, madly trying to think of a way to stall until the evidence of his crime had departed. "Mr. Wells?" a woman's voice responded from outside. The way her words sounded, as if they were passing through a long tube, brought him instant relief. It was a telltale characteristic of a 23rd century environmental suit. "I'm designate Node 23, and I'm from the future. Would you be pleased to put your name in my anthology of The Martian Chronicles?" Herbert allowed himself a sly grin. The title sounded promising. He wondered if it could be a sequel to his first Martian book. "Just a minute," he said, picking up his pistol. "I'll be right there." No longer interested in wasting time, Herbert hurried to the door. He raised the gun to about chest level before lifting the latch and turning the knob. It was going to be a very productive afternoon.
Though this story is evidently a work of fiction, Dominick Cancilla was really clever to borrow the thread of time travel from H.G. Wells himself and consider what the implications of that may be if time travel were truly possible. Dominick Cancilla is a modern author of both fiction and non-fiction, living in California. He's written numerous short stories and a horror novel called Revenant Savior. Now, on the back of this story, I want to ask you, if you had the chance to go back in time, which author would you visit? H.G. Wells would definitely be top of the list for lots of our listeners. Personally, I think I'd rather meet his wife. We recently published The Open Heart, a collection of Catherine Wells' literary work. If you listened to our May special, where we spoke to the editors, Patrick Parender and Emmeline Godfrey, she may already be on your radar, but her authorial work is often overlooked. So, today, Olivia is going to be reading one of her short stories called The Ghost. This is one of the smaller stories within the Open Heart collection, but it's a great example of her writing style. Reviewer, The Ginger Nuts of Horror, described The Ghost as a straightforward tale with a straightforward twist, but told to the best of its ability with an effective sense of moodiness and wistfulness. Let's see if you agree. This is The Ghost by Catherine Wells, read by Olivia.
She was a girl of 14, and she sat propped up with pillows in an old 4-poster bed, coughing a little with the feverish cold that kept her there. She was tired of reading by lamplight, and she lay and listened to the few sounds that she could hear, and looked into the fire. From downstairs, down the wide, rather dark oak-panelled corridor hung with brown ochre pictures of tremendous naval engagements exploding fierily in their centres, down the broad stone stairs that ended in a heavy, creaking, nail-studded door, there blew into her remoteness sometimes a gust of dance music. Cousins and cousins and cousins were down there, and Uncle Timothy, as host, leading the fun. Several of them had danced into her room during the day, and said that her illness was a perfect shame, told her that the skating in the park was too heavenly, and danced out again. Uncle Timothy had been as kind could be, but downstairs all the full cup of happiness the lonely child had looked forward to so eagerly for a month was running away like liquid gold. She watched the flames of the big wood fire in the open grate flicker and fall. She had sometimes to clench her hands to prevent herself from crying. She had discovered, so early was she beginning to collect her little stock of feminine lore, that if you swallowed hard and rapidly as the tears gathered, that you could prevent your eyes brimming over. She wished someone would come. There was a bell within her reach, but she could think of no plausible excuse for ringing it. She wished there was more light in the room. The big fire lit it up cheerfully when the logs flared high, but when they only glowed, the dark shadows crept down from the ceiling and gathered in the corners against the panelling. She turned from the scrutiny of the room to the bright circle of light under the lamp on the table beside her, and the companionable suggestiveness of the currant jelly and spoon, grapes and lemonade, and little pile of books and kindly fuss that shone warmly and comfortingly there. Perhaps it would not be long before Mrs. Bunting, her uncle's housekeeper, would come in again and sit down and talk to her. Mrs. Bunting, very probably, was more occupied than usual that evening. There were several extra guests. Another house party had motored over for the evening, and they had brought with them a romantic figure, a celebrity, no less a personage than the actor Percival East. The girl had indeed broken down from her fortitude that afternoon when Uncle Timothy had told her of this visitor. Uncle Timothy was surprised. It was only another schoolgirl who would have understood fully what it meant to be denied by a mere cold the chance of meeting face to face that chivalrous hero of drama. Another girl who had glowed at his daring, wept at his noble renunciations, been made happy, albeit enviously and vicariously, by his final embrace with the lady of his love. "There, there, dear child," Uncle Timothy had said, patting her shoulder and greatly distressed. Never mind. If you can't get up, I'll bring him in here to see you. I promise I will. But the pull these chaps have over you little women," he went on, half to himself. The panelling creaked. Of course, it always did in these old houses. She was of that order of apprehensive, slightly nervous people who do not believe in ghosts, but all the same hope devoutly they may never see one. Surely it was a long time since anyone had visited her. It would be hours, she supposed, before the girl who had the room next to her own, into which a communicating door comfortingly led, came up to bed. If she rang, it took a minute or two before anyone reached her from the remote servants' quarters. There ought soon, she thought, to be a housemaid about the corridor outside, tidying up the bedrooms, putting coal on the fire, and making such like companionable noises. That would be pleasant. How bored one got in bed anyhow, and how dreadful it was, how unbearably dreadful it was that she should be stuck in bed now, missing everything. Missing every bit of the glorious, glowing time that was slipping away down there. At that, she had to begin swallowing her tears again. With a sudden burst of sound, a storm of clapping and laughter, the heavy door at the foot of the big stairs swung open and closed. Footsteps came upstairs, and she heard men's voices approaching. Uncle Timothy. He knocked at the door afar. "Come in," she cried gladly. With him was a quiet-faced, greyish-haired man of middle age. Then Uncle had sent for the doctor after all. "Here is another of your young worshippers, Mr. East," said Uncle Timothy. Mr. East! She realised in a flash that she had expected him in purple brocade, powdered hair and ruffles of fine lace. Her uncle smiled at her disconcerted face. "She doesn't seem to recognise you, Mr. East," said Uncle Timothy. "Of course I do," she declared bravely, and sat up, flushed with excitement and her feverishness, bright-eyed and with ruffled hair. Indeed, she began to see the stage hero she remembered and the kindly-faced man before her flow together like a composite portrait. There was the little nod of the head, there was the chin, yes, and the eyes, now she came to look at them. "Why were they all clapping you?" she asked. "Because I had just promised to frighten them out of their wits," replied Mr. East. "Oh, how?" "Mr. East," said Uncle Timothy, "is going to dress up as our long-lost ghost and give us a really shuddering time of it downstairs." "Are you?" cried the girl with all the fierce desire that only a girl can utter in her voice. "Oh, why am I ill like this, Uncle Timothy? I'm not ill, really. Can't you see I'm better? I've been in bed all day. I'm perfectly well. Can't I come down, Uncle dear? Can't I?" In her excitement, she was half out of bed. There, child," soothed Uncle Timothy, hastily smoothing the bedclothes and trying to tuck her in. "But can't I?" "Of course, if you want to be thoroughly frightened out of your wits, mind you," began Percival East. I do, she cried, bouncing up and down in her bed. "I'll come and show myself when I'm dressed up before I go down." "Oh, please, she cried back radiantly. A private performance all to herself. Will you be perfectly awful?" she laughed exultantly. "As ever I can," smiled Mr. East, and turned to follow Uncle Timothy out of the room. "You know," he said, holding the door and looking back at her with mock seriousness, I shall look rather horrid, I expect. Are you sure you won't mind? Mind? When it's you, laughed the girl. He went out of the room, shutting the door. Rum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tea, she hummed gaily, and wriggled down into her bedclothes again, straightened the sheet over her chest, and prepared to wait. She lay quietly for some time, with a smile on her face, thinking of Percival East and fitting his grave, kindly face back into its various dramatic settings. She was quite satisfied with him. She began to go over in her mind in detail the last play in which she had seen him act. How splendid he had looked when he fought the duel. She couldn't imagine him gruesome, she thought. What would he do with himself? Whatever he did, she wasn't going to be frightened. He shouldn't be able to boast he had frightened her. Uncle Timothy would be there too, she supposed. Would he? Footsteps went past her door outside, along the corridor, and died away. The big door at the end of the stairs opened and clanged shut. Uncle Timothy had gone down. She waited on. A log, burnt through the middle to a ruddy thread, fell suddenly in 2 tumbling pieces on the hearth. She started at the sound. How quiet everything was. How much longer would he be, she wondered. The fire wanted making up, the pieces of wood collecting together. Should she ring? But he might come in just when the servant was mending the fire, and that would spoil his entry. The fire could wait. The room was very still, and with the fallen fire, darker. She heard no more any sound at all from downstairs. That was because her door was shut. All day it had been open, but now the last slender link that held her to downstairs was broken. The lamp flame gave a sudden fitful leap. Why? Was it going out? Was it? No. She hoped he wouldn't jump out at her, but of course he wouldn't. Anyhow, whatever he did, she wouldn't be frightened, really frightened. Forewarned is forearmed. Was that a sound? She started up, her eyes on the door. Nothing. But surely. The door had minutely moved. It did not sit back quite so close into its frame. Perhaps it... Oh, she was sure it had moved. Yes, it had moved. Opened an inch. And slowly, as she watched, she saw a thread of light grow between the edge of the door and its frame, grow almost imperceptibly wider, and stop. He could never come through that. It must have yawned open of its own accord. Her heart began to beat rather quickly. She could see only the upper part of the door. The foot of her bed hid the lower third. Her attention tightened. Suddenly as a pistol shot, she saw that there was a little figure like a dwarf near the wall, between the door and the fireplace. It was a little cloaked figure, no higher than the table. How did he do it? It was moving slowly, very slowly towards the fire, as if it was quite unconscious of her. It was wrapped about in a cloak that trailed, with a slouched hat on its head bent down its shoulders. She gripped the clothes with her hands. It was so queer, so unexpected. She gave a little gasping laugh to break the tension of the silence, to show she appreciated them. The dwarf stopped dead at the sound, and turned its face round to her. Oh, but she was frightened! It was a dead white face, a long pointed face hunched between its shoulders. There was no colour in the eyes that stared at her. How did he do it? How did he do it? It was too good. She laughed again nervously, and with a clutch of terror that she could not control. She saw the figure move out of the shadow and come towards her. She braced herself with all of her might. She mustn't be frightened by a bit of acting. He was coming nearer. It was horrible. Right up to her bed. She flung her head beneath her bedclothes. Whether she screamed or not, she never knew. Someone was rapping at her door, speaking cheerily. She took her head out of the clothes with a revulsion of shame at her fright. The horrible little creature was gone. Mr. East was speaking at her door. What was it he was saying? What? I'm ready now, he said. Shall I come in and begin?
I love this one. At surface level, as phrased by Ginger Nuts of Horror, it is straightforward. But I think that if you truly listened, you'd spot that there's plenty more at play here, particularly in regard to the character dynamics. The 14-year-old protagonist is on the brink of discovering her sexuality. She's taking stock of her feminine lore and lusting after an older man, while still speaking and expressing herself in the tones of a child. It's also worth noting that this entire story symbolically takes place in her bedchamber. But this is just my interpretation. You don't have to agree with me or see the story that way. This is just one of those moments where I'd love for you guys to be able to talk back to me so we could have a bit of a discussion about it. But anyway, I'll tell you a little bit more about the author, Catherine Wells. She was born Amy Catherine Robbins, and she worked as a teacher and studied at Tutorial College in London, where she met and married H.G. Wells. She has always been regarded as a great supporter of her husband's work, but as you can see, she herself was a serious writer, quietly creating her own stories and poems. You can hear a little bit more about her work and her life in our podcast episode, Deserted with Catherine Wells. Now, I feel like I have to do a little bit of a disclaimer at the end of this episode. We are big fans of H.G. Wells' work at Flame Tree, and given how many of his stories are in our collections, we will undoubtedly feature his work on this podcast at some point too. This episode only intends to examine a great author from a slightly different angle. A big thank you to our authors and narrators. Please take a look at our time travel short story collections and/or The Open Heart by Catherine Wells.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast and look forward to the next episode. Do recommend it to your friends. Goodbye for now.